Yeah.
Mm.
So
Just before we get into that, Hugo, I'm just wondering, you mentioned Quelque Fleur, that you had a...
Yes. Oh, yes.
Should we just hear what that is before we get
Thank you. Thank you. And it may be that you both contribute a little bit of the genealogy of it. So in Johnson, in your notes, it talks about Missouri and Granny getting
last time.
Quelque Fleur, and that became her favorite perfume, which I think we all knew, and she was age 17. Somehow that bottle migrated perhaps to Mummy, I don't know, perhaps to you too, I don't know, but eventually ended up with me. And I gave it to Fleur, and it was an empty bottle, and it wasn't eau de cologne, it was perfume. And when I visited her last in Vancouver, I said somewhere in the conversations we had, do you have any little treasures that you like to remember things by? And she produced a little box, and the biggest thing that came out was Granny's bottle of Quelque Fleur perfume, empty. But you could still smell the perfume. Previously to that, I had been on in England and gone to visit them at Harrods, who have fantastic perfume selection. And they said, no, it's been discontinued. Houbigant is the maker, and Quelque Fleur was the fragrance. And it's just like the beer business. When beer is one generation older, it becomes dad's beer, and it's no longer cool. In the perfume world, I think it's the lifetime of the person who takes it up, but then it's no longer cool. But both beer and perfume bring them back after a decent time. So I have regularly gone online, and just before the visit to Vancouver, I had, by coincidence, not anything else, gone online and found that Quelque Fleur had been reintroduced.
Gosh.
So when Fleur said, this is what I've got from Gran, as she called her, I then ordered it online, perfume, for her next Christmas present. So there's the genealogy. It's gone now.
How nice. How nice.
Granny
It's like the name Ruby coming back, you know, that it skips a couple of generations and then it returns.
Absolutely. And Georgina too. I think Brittany particularly likes Georgina, and I wouldn't bet against, if she had a daughter, that it might show up there. So did either of you have it as a caretaker on the way, or how did it get to me?
I don't remember seeing it at all, but I was more involved with the lipstick, not the perfume, because Granny obviously found these things at 17 and never changed them for the rest of her life.
Right.
She always had it, exactly. And the lipstick I remember as being quite dark and more like a stain than a glossy modern waterproof one that she liked to use. And I've lost the name of it, but I can remember her ruefully saying that she was out of it and couldn't find it. And I did the equivalent of the online research in those days, whatever it was, and I was triumphant to send her a fresh one to feel that I had been useful to her, that I had actually got one. And I can't remember more about the story than that. And I wish I could had the same name that I could come up with, but the story of the perfume is more powerful simply because it's something that could be used now, whereas I don't suppose Fleur or Brittany would want the stain lipstick. It might, I don't know, maybe it'd be round here. Anyway.
And just to finish off these associations, the chocolates that Bampa was giving Granny in their courtship before they were married, which she sheepishly had to admit she didn't actually like chocolates very much. They were Charbonnel and Walker, just for the record. Which does still exists. So that's
Daddy
top of the range chocolate.
To give Mummy mint Furpos, didn't he? And I never knew where they came from, but every year there was a box of Furpos mint chocolates, which Mummy used to have. But whether they were shipped out from England or were available somehow in Cornport, absolutely no idea. But dutifully every year out they came, I think.
So, don't know why. I think they came from Calcutta, but maybe Calcutta was the main distributor into select places of India.
Harrod's equivalent or something. Anyway, so I want to tell the story about how come Bampar and his brothers, one brother anyway, were born in Laramie, Wyoming. So it's a story of two families, the Ivinsons and the Wilkinsons. So I'm hoping I don't lose you in all the detail, but with the preliminary reading, hopefully it will make sense. So starting with the Ivinsons, the main character in terms of Laramie is Edward Ivinson, which is the one I sent you the biography of. And he arrives at Laramie absolutely at the beginning of the founding of Laramie. There is nothing there. The train hasn't even come at the point he gets there. It's a promise on the map that the next city that the train will come to is going to be called Laramie, and it doesn't even belong to Wyoming then. It's part of North Dakota or South Dakota. Black Hills on one side and the plains on the other. Real sort of open country with bison and stuff like that, I think. And his story is quite interesting. It starts with his father, which is Thomas Ivinson. Thomas Ivinson is an Englishman who goes out to the Virgin Islands to manage a plantation. And I don't know if he owns a plantation, but he certainly is connected with a plantation. And in those days, the Virgin Islands were owned by the Danish. They were known as the Danish Virgin Islands, not the American or the British or anything else. I think they're American now, but whatever it is, he was in the plantation business. I don't know whether slaves are involved. One doesn't like to know. At least they're not direct family, so it doesn't really matter whether they were or not. But Thomas had all his children there, including Edward, who he come to. And each of them, in turn, having been born, is sent back to England for education. And to get my dates right, Thomas himself was born 1802. The children, Edward is born 1830, so it's when he's 28. So he actually has 7 children. Edward is the 4th one. And the grandparents are still in Cumbria. Some of them stay with the grandparents, but they obviously arrange the education there. And there is a family tragedy in 1846, when the children are quite young, they're sort of 16 or 17, when the mother sets off in a ship with the youngest to visit her children in England, and the ship founders and she's drowned with the smallest child and goes down. So the father is left bereaved widow in the Virgin Islands. Children are away in England. He famously, according to the research on him, takes a mistress who he has another 5 children by.
Oh, gosh.
At that point. So he has 7 of his own by his proper wife and another 5 by his, what did they call them, blow-beside or something, I don't know, whatever it was, his private arrangement. And then he dies in 1856. Edward by that point is 26. His will is known. It was been traced by one of the Laramie researchers. So he is sort of known, but from that background, born in the West Indies, growing up in Cumberland, educated in Cumberland, Edward sets sail for New York to further his life. And if you saw in his notes that he has this life-changing meeting Jane at an incredibly young age, 10 years younger than him. I think he was 23 and she was 13 or something scary. But they are actually perfectly suited for each other and spend 61 years together in happy marriage. And he heads off initially down south, where probably life was a little bit nearer plantation life, I would think, in those days. And sort of, he gets to Laramie in 1868, so maybe in 1850s or something like that, and tries various things. But he ends up looking for a new place to move to because there's a medical alert in where he is. Cholera comes through, or typhus, I can't remember which it is, it's in the note. And he sets off to explore where the train tracks are going to for opportunities. And he thinks he's going to go to Cheyenne, which is where the train went to. But he actually goes 50 miles further west to Laramie, where there's nothing, but there will be something. The train's going to come, and he likes the feel of it. So Edward gets his wife and adopted daughter to come, and the letter from Jane describes the chaos of empty landscape and huts and nowhere to sleep and the rain coming through the roof, and all her obsession is with raising churches and raising education, which shows that amazing Victorian drive to sort things, form a committee, same as in Cornwall, get things built, have Sunday school classes, get them something. And that is a theme of Edward Ivinson's life, that he is very much connected with the founding of the university and the providing homes for children and schools for children and all the rest of it. Anyway, so he becomes a major player in Laramie life, initially as a grocery store owner, and then as founding the first bank of Laramie, or buying out the bank and making the first bank of Laramie. And Laramie was obviously booming, and my guess is that all these booming people wanting to buy more land, wanting to buy farmland, wanting to build, all needed cash. So you go to the bank for a loan, and as in always with banking, he lends you the money at a higher interest rate than he himself has to pay to borrow the money. And he has banking funds coming in from wherever he has banking funds, and makes his profit. So he flourishes and becomes a major wealthy citizen of Laramie. And it's clear that even now, one of the big roads is Ivinson Street or Avenue, right in the center of Laramie. So how do we ever get connected to this guy, which is a different story. So if I haven't lost you so far, moving across to Bampar's grandfather. Bampar's grandfather is called Charles Russell Wilkinson, and he is the son of the famous Thomas Joseph Wilkinson. And Thomas Joseph is mainly famous for getting himself painted. And you can probably remember the paintings. There's two of them. We have one with Sarah Russell and a gypsy telling their fortune, and the other one of Sarah Russell on her own. And his story was that his father, Thomas Wilkinson, made an absolute fortune, the richest of all of us, even more than you, Hugo, I think. Owned tea warehouses when it was very important, and dock stuff in Liverpool, and was a real Yorkshire business tycoon. And Thomas Joseph, as his eldest son, lived a good life as a gentleman because he had his father's wealth, so that he didn't have to work. He always described himself as a gentleman, had a lovely house built for himself in Hampstead, owned some of Turner's watercolors, but at some point fell for Sarah Russell while his wife was still alive, and started having children by Sarah Russell. And they were all called something Russell Wilkinson. So Thomas Russell Wilkinson, Sarah Russell Wilkinson. And our Bampar's grandfather is Charles Russell Wilkinson. And when Thomas Joseph had died, some of his children who weren't out of Sarah Russell discovered that they were illegitimate, or the ones were, and one of them was a vicar, and he burnt all the papers to do with Thomas Joseph. So there's a big space where the story of Thomas Joseph should be, which we don't really know. But anyway, we're not concerned with him. So Charles Russell lived a life as a banker, living in a very nice Greenwich house. If you look up his address, I think it's Ashburnham Villas, you'll see a very smart, white, typical Victorian villa, very agreeable. Journey into London somehow, I have no idea how. And initially he has contracts with providing for the army, but then he's described as a banker's clerk. And he's married and has, I think, 5 children. And then his wife dies, and somehow he finds a second wife and gets married in 1861 in Crickhowell, which is near Abergavenny, to a lady called Jane Thomas, who's the one in that photo I sent you. So Crickhole is 6 miles from Abergavenny, which of course you think of to do with the faces and things, but at that point, Charles Russell Wilkinson has got no connection to the faces. I mean, it's his son who was connected to the faces later on, but somehow there is a link which brings him in contact with Jane Thomas. Jane Thomas is never married. Jane Thomas is, how old is she? She's 2 years younger, I think. But anyway, they meet and get married, and they have 3 boys. And the first of them is also called Charles William, and he is Bumper's father. And then there is 2 other sons, Herbert and Edwin. So let us get us roughly on track for the date. So Charles William Bumper's father is born in 1862, Herbert 1864, Edwin 1869. Now, if you remember, the Laramie Iverson started in 1868, so they are ahead of the arrival of these boys, but they are sitting under a banker father, Charles Russell, and as they come into working age, they too get trained as a banker's clerk. So Bumper's father is listed in a census as a banker's clerk. And my memory says Mummy's stories are that the bank they worked in London was called Brindley's Bank. And I don't know that.
Brindley? Did you say Brindley?
Yeah. That's
Isn't that the Queen's Bank?
It could be, well, there's Coots as well, but
one of them, yes.
But certainly a classy bank, I think. So, how did the link happen? Well, Edward Iverson, he was the 4th child, as I say, and his sister, Frances, was a year older, so a year earlier. And she was also doing the thing about being educated in Cumbria, and was there when her mother died in the ship foundry, and at some point was ready to return to life in America, where Edward was by then well established. And she sets off on the usual Liverpool to New York transport and has a shipboard romance with William Thomas. William Thomas is the brother of the Jane Thomas that you now have the picture of. So William Thomas was on the shipboard, was 23. Francis was coming out of Cumbria at 25. They were so mad for each other that as soon as they arrived in New York, they got married. And as far as we know, it was a very happy marriage. They initially settled in Pittsburgh, but of course, Francis introduced William, her new husband, to Edward Iverson, because Frances was Edward Iveson's sister. So Frances took William to see Laramie and to see Edward Iverson. And there's a charming side of Laramie newspapers, which is, it was so provincial that there was a regular column in every issue saying, "In town today," and they would list any visiting people to say, Joe Collins from New York or something, seeing Mr. So-and-so or something. So there are records of people visiting, and there are at least 2 recorded times when William Thomas and his wife Frances come to visit the Iversons, and one of them is recorded as going hunting on a hunting trip with Edward Iverson. And of course, this is big buffalo country thing, so it might well have even been bisons that they were hunting. Who knows? Maybe deer or something. So that is the beginning of the link. And at some point, back in London, Charles Russell, the father, dies, leaving Jane Thomas as a widow with her 3 boys. Charles dies, where does he die? He dies in 1874. So we're all about the same sort of time. At that point, the boys are 12, 10, and 5. So William would be concerned about his widowed sister back in London and her 3 boys. And as they grew older and began getting involved in the banking business, sorry, I just gonna let Bumble out 1 second. Must have reached out and said, put these 2 together. Edward is a banking man. Laramie is a land of opportunities. Send the boys out as soon as they're able. And we don't know, at least I don't know yet, entirely when Bampar's father gets there, but he's married there in St. Matthew's Cathedral in 1887. So 1887, when his father died in 1874, is 13 years later. Charles William is 25. So as a very young man, the 3 brothers go out. Where Gertrude Sophia Facey meets him, I have no idea. I haven't worked that one out because I can't see why she would be on the ship to America unless they'd already met. So I think they meet in court in London somehow before they ever set off. But they arrive and get married in Laramie. As once they've got to Laramie, under the shield of Edward Ivinson, Bampar's father, Charles William, and the 2 brothers all set about a combination of banking and real estate deals, because you possibly read in the notes that Edward Ivinson, starting as a pure banker, began getting involved in real estate more than banking itself. He sold the bank over, and then he started another bank in Mexico or somewhere. So this, I think, is where Bampar's father suddenly gets into this heady world where he gets a major leg up. He has an uncle who's a patriarch of Laramie, and is very wealthy, able to introduce him to anywhere he needs to be, and opens all doors for him. So suddenly he has this great opportunity, and no one knows what he went about, but I'm sure that Edward Ivinson, his uncle, steered him towards the sort of thing he should be looking at and where the opportunities were. And so they make their money. So having got married there in 1887, Russell is born in 1888, the next year. 2 years later, Bampar arrives in 1890, but Grace is born back in Abergavenny in 1892. So Charles William doesn't stay a long time. He's must have been there in 1887. He's gone by 1892 for Grace being born in Abergavenny. So probably around 5 years. But there is a letter from Charles William to Russell saying, I'm looking forward to seeing you soon. I'll be back. We'll have such fun playing together. I'll bring you this and I'll bring you that. Grace is too small for presents yet, isn't she? Which means that he must have brought them back and then gone back to Laramie, and then gone back to Monmouth again before he dies. So that is sort of how Bampar ends up with Laramie, Wyoming on his passport. Of the 3 brothers, the first one obviously is Charles William Bampar's father, who drowns in the river in the River Wye and near Monmouth, going for a walk. No one knows whether he slipped or pushed or jumped. It's actually, I think, quite hard to drown yourself in a river. If you jump in a river intending to drown yourself, it's fairly tricky. I could see people going in after, in a rescue mission, getting tangled up in the reeds or something. But it's actually fairly instinctive to keep swimming or to rise to the surface and breathe. So I don't know how that one could have been a suicide easily. Anyway, it's a mystery. Amazingly, Edwin, the youngest of them, dies with a gun accident. And again, it's an open verdict when it goes to the coroner. They can't work out if they think he's cleaning his gun. They don't know whether he made a mistake, whether he killed himself. His older brother's death in the river is mentioned, saying maybe it clouded his mind, but it's actually quite a lot later. It's about
It's in England, is it, or in Wales?
in Laramie.
Yes, in Laramie.
Laramie, yes. Is so Edwin. So Edwin was the one who stayed in Laramie. The middle son, Herbert, heads off for Montana at some point and dies a normal death. He lives the longest and has a good long life based in Montana. And I don't know very much about what he did, but that
Doesn't his mother go with him?
well, his mother ends up going there after Edward Iverson had died. But there is this quite a period where Jane Thomas has emerged from widowhood in London to become the companion of Edward Iverson as her brother, saying he is my brother-in-law, which I suppose is quite a close relationship. I mean, that's like me to Rob or whatever. But Edward Iverson has a big enough house and enough money to say, you can stay with us, just stay with us. And I think once his wife dies, he probably is glad of having a female hand around the house. And Jane Thomas tells a story that the Iversons' best friends were another couple who were very wealthy, the other big wealthy people in Laramie, I guess. And when the husband of that partnership died, it left a wealthy widow. And Jane Thomas describes her as my best friend. And she said she had been left with an estate of 3 million or 5 million and was very wealthy and was talking about trips to Europe and would Jane Thomas Wilkinson go with her? And she was gearing herself up to a life of travel and luxury touring Europe. And then Edward Iverson decided that she might be his next wife. And in some way, Jane Thomas Wilkinson sort of facilitated that. And they got married at sort of age 89 and 75 or something, and it didn't work out. Within 5 or 6 months, they were not talking to each other, and it didn't work out, and Jane Wilkinson didn't get her trip to Europe. But she lives quite the life. She, in her letters back, which I think we have 2 or 3 of, she says we can have winter in Denver, which turns out to be quite close to Laramie, just down south from it.
South, yeah.
Yep. And we can have summers in California or something, and it's sort of like the socialite life. And she doesn't seem to have any great problems with being the sponger on the rich family. She feels it's my family too. It's my brother-in-law. And I think when Edward Iverson dies, she heads off to Montana to stay with her remaining son, Herbert. And she gets quite the write-up in the Montana newspapers when she eventually dies. They call her a death of great matriarch, 90-year-old matriarch. She's another of the famous women who live past 90 in the family and make Joanna smile because she's got good genes, unlike the men folk. But she comes across as quite warm to Russell and Vampire. She writes to Viva and obviously takes an interest in her grandchildren, but lives this extraordinary journey from Wales to somehow getting married to a banker in London and Greenwich, to somehow moving at the push of her brother to Laramie, Wyoming, and the house of a very wealthy man. And if you look in that article, you'll see that White House, which he calls the Laramie the Iversons mansion, which he gives to be a children's school. And there is a photo of Gertrude Sophia Facey and Jane Thomas, her mother-in-law, standing outside it. So when Vampire's father went there and got married, he must have had a room there or spent time there or visited there for social occasions or whatever it was. I don't know. So that's the story. How does that sound?
Well, fascinating. And Jonathan, I didn't know a third of that. So really, thank you for researching it and being so.
Tonight was I suddenly noticed her letter. I was thinking, how come she was living on in the high life in Laramie? And in a letter she said, "Mr. Ivinson, my brother-in-law, he's practically family, or he is family." And I then contacted Wynyard and I said, "I don't think I understand why she's related to Edward Ivinson." And he said, "Oh, we haven't researched that." And it turned out that we needed to discover about Edward Ivinson's sister Frances, and then William Thomas and William Thomas's connection to Jane Thomas.
The thing, do we know though what brought Bampar's father back to Wales? We don't.
No, don't know. One could only speculate. Did something go wrong? You know, it's a bit like a roulette wheel job. You know, there is a point where you pick up your chips and head out, or keep on gambling. I think it was probably a fairly high risk world. But whether there was something where he was blamed or didn't work well, or whether he just had an instinct that he had gone on long enough, I don't know.
Jonathan, a technical question, then a comment. Do we, hearing the banking sort of training for the younger people, when Bampar Harold went to India, was it that banking experience that was his first stepping stone into?
No, I don't. I mean, it may have rubbed off on him a little bit, because I think he probably would have had an instinct that he would work in an office, in business, with paper and his mind.
Yeah.
I've seen something which was probably around his wedding or something like that, or something where he describes himself as an accountant, strangely enough. But I mentioned that to Thean, and Thean looked very shocked and surprised and said, "No, I didn't think so." But it is actually on some official document where he called himself that. So I think not exactly did he ever see himself as a banker, but I think he was certainly in a mold which was very close, like a cousin to a banker.
Yeah. Administrative capabilities in a wider sense. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Where money, and isn't there a parallel with what Bampar arrived and eventually did with what Daddy did? I mean, he comes from his insurance side and ends up, you would say, what does he learn the business of? He learns the business of banking in a sort of third world or second tier world, which needs funds to develop its businesses in a way. So quite similar. But you know, everyone survives. I was looking at the house that Charles Russell was in Greenwich, and it's a lovely house. And I was looking at the probate value of Bampar's father after he drowned, and he's still worth, local money is something like £800 or something, and I don't know what that translates back to, but it's not broke. It's you know, you're probably talking 30,000 or something. I don't know, modern money from that far back. And Gertrude Sophia, who is then left a widow, she ends up in London. She's in something like number 4 Paulton Square, and you think, Paulton Square, come on, that's South Kensington. That's completely desirable, and her probate is something like 14,000 or something. So you think everybody, despite all the death mysteries and all the rest of it, they all end up quite well on their feet, which is rather nice.
I like JJ. I humbly say I probably knew 5% of what you've taken us through. And it's a fascinating story. I marveled as I read it all at how it was facilitated, because if you take as an example, he arrives in Laramie and we hear there's a roof but no side flaps, and that's the only construct there. And then he goes back to get his family from Memphis and come back and so on. The in-between bits that are missing are, how did you do that?
Yes.
There weren't telecommunications. There almost certainly weren't any kind of phone. It's 1,000 miles to Memphis, and to go and get and come back and so on is a massive undertaking, just little simple things like that. To decide we're going to go to San Francisco or the West Coast and do things there. I mean, I marvel at the can-do, make it happen attitude that
Yes,
is demonstrated by these stories. Incredible.
it's extraordinary confidence. And even the thing of setting off from London to go to Liverpool to catch a boat, to go to New York, to go to Laramie.
Yeah, yeah.
Each leg of that, it's a major adventure. But then, you know, in our immediate ancestry, we have Bampa heading out to India, we have Daddy heading out to India, and no message got there inside 3 or 4 weeks or whatever it is. You know, that
Yeah, yeah.
it is extraordinary brave stuff.
As you'll remember about Daddy, he loved to send cables or telegrams. We would all get little short things, but that was his great pleasure, I think, to use that.
So Ron Hugh John Joe, and he that was a valid word. It should be £1 for 1 penny or whatever it was. One word was.
Yeah.
Telegram. Do you remember? Yeah. Well, telegrams only now come for weddings. I think. I'm not sure that there's much more sent, but they would have had. I mean, if you think of the cowboy films, they would have had sort of covered wagons in those days, kept traveling out, and then the train would have covered it. And the Wells Fargo would have had Pony Express, and the little guy in the railway station was going with his Morse code sending your telegram.
So it's interesting to think about the real historic events going on at the same time as this. And certainly when Edward Ivinson goes to Laramie, it is not long after the American Civil War. It's hard on the heels of that. And we might look out for, I was just reading the reviews now that I'm a Netflix subscriber, frightfully, 21st century, of this new Tom Hanks film called News of the World, which is set in exactly this area, exactly then.
Okay.
So we might want to look out for just for kind of what it was like.
Running out of time. Didn't realize it was the same thing, but I mean, the whole Wild West thing followed the end of the Civil War, where people trained to be soldiers wandered off at a footloose thing to try and find a new life, and fought gun battles and things. So it's pretty interesting time to arrive into Wyoming, I'm sure. Anyway,
extraordinary.
And from that we all grew. So,
how are we doing? Are we out?
Yep.
We're done.
Yeah. Nice to speak.
Good session. Thanks, Jonathan, for prep.
Very helpful.
Talk to you on Friday.
Okay. Bye.